Hello, everyone. Sorry about the delay there. Had some technical issues, but I think we're all set now. Thanks for joining us today for the first in a series of webinars that we'll be conducting under the WGA Working Lands Roundtable. Today's webinar is going to be examining the near-term and long-term impacts of COVID-19 to natural resource management. My name is Zach Bodane. I'm a policy advisor at Western Governors Association. And before I turn things over to our moderator, I'd like to take a minute to just provide a bit of background on what the Working Lands Roundtable is and why we stood it up for those who may not be familiar with it. So the WGA Working Lands Roundtable was officially launched in 2018 following a number of successful natural resource-focused WGA chair initiatives. The roundtable serves in part to continue implementation of those initiatives, but I think its bigger and broader purpose is to take a look at cross-boundary and multidisciplinary resource management issues. Through the roundtable, WGA is really seeking to tap into the expertise of a wide range of resource management and conservation professionals to engage in a discussion on large-scale, cross-boundary, multidisciplinary policy solutions that will ultimately enhance the resiliency of the Western working landscape and the communities that these landscapes support. So I think I said it at the top, but I want to reiterate that this webinar is the first in a series that will be examining the impacts of COVID-19 to resource management and rural communities in the West under the WGA Working Lands Roundtable. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to quickly just go over a few logistics. I'm joined today by our moderator, Dr. Kristen Averyt. I'll let Kristen and the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but a few quick logistical notes. Each panelist is going to deliver brief opening remarks, and following those remarks, we'll then turn to a moderated discussion. After the moderated discussion amongst panelists, we'll have a brief question and answer session that is going to be open to all attendees. All attendees are currently on mute, but if you want to ask a question to any of the panelists, please type it into that attendee chat box that you'll see on the left side of your screen at any point during the webinar. I'll be keeping an eye on that chat box and pulling questions to send to Kristen. Finally, there's going to be a recording of this event available on the WGA YouTube channel and website that we can let folks know about as it's up. So with all of that said, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Averyt to kick us off. Kristen?
Thank you, Zach. So my name is Kristen Averyt, and I am the State Policy Climate Coordinator for the state of Nevada, and I'm embedded in the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in our state. Now, we all know that COVID-19 has completely upended our world, and we hear so much about the impacts to our health, the impacts to our economy, and of course, the impact to education, because so many of us have little kiddos at home right now, right? But really, we have there are direct impacts to our ecosystems and to our environment. And this is creating unique challenges as well as opportunities for how we manage our natural resources. Now in Nevada, we've had, of course, similar experiences to a lot of the folks that are joining us today. For example, one of the big impacts that we're seeing is with respect to public comment and making sure that we have stakeholder engaged processes when it comes to rulemaking. We're experiencing challenges because we have very strict open meeting rules in the state of Nevada, and some of those rules have been waived. And so we're getting a lot of pushback and a lot of legitimate criticism, particularly in our rural communities, because of broadband and access issues. And that's something unique that we're trying to navigate. We're also, of course, just in a resource limited environment and with social distancing. Our Department of Environmental Protection, how do we move forward with inspections and on-site inspections? And this week, I don't know if folks are aware, but we had a 6.4 magnitude earthquake in the state of Nevada. And we were fortunate that it was truly in the middle of nowhere. But that brings on the issue of compounding challenges if we have other natural disasters that emerge. So how do we manage that in a pandemic situation? Of course, that brings us to wildfire, which we will be talking about in more detail today. We have specific issues for Nevada. One is our conservation camp crews. The bulk of our crews are comprised of inmates, and they're the low-risk inmates, many of whom have actually been let out of jail and prison because of the pandemic to make sure that we reduce the spread in the prison population. So we are having staffing issues across our state. And then probably one of the largest challenges that we're facing is with outdoor recreation. Our state is one of the most urbanized in the US. Over 98% of our population lives in the Las Vegas area or in the Reno Carson area. And the bulk of the rest of the landscape is actually public lands. Our state parks have remained closed to camping, but open for day use through the pandemic. But with everything else shuttered, this has really channeled everybody in the state into highly populated areas to our state parks. So we really are grappling with, number one, making sure that our parks aren't loved to death. But then number two, a lot of new recreators who are trying to educate about things like leave no trace, et cetera. And that's creating a challenge in terms of our human resources and the availability. And then, of course, our gateway communities and our rurals, as people are leaving the urbanized areas and heading out, and particularly camping in BLM land, they're exposing some of our rural communities that have had zero infection rates to the possibility of infection. And we don't want to overwhelm those hospitals. So that's another management challenge. And then finally, the cross-jurisdictional issues that a lot of us are experiencing. We are home in Nevada to both Lake Tahoe in the north and Lake Mead in the south. In Lake Tahoe, we've had issues with boat ramps with respect to both California and Nevada. How do we manage and coordinate the opening and the closure? And we have a very robust boat inspection program up there to make sure that we don't spread quagga mussel. That's our big invasive challenge up there. And that boat inspection program is at risk. And then with Lake Mead, where should we share a border with Arizona? Arizona has remained open through most of the pandemic while we have remained closed. So part of that challenge, again, it's a coordination, but it's also a federal national recreation area. So again, those multi-jurisdictional issues are creating challenges. And we have a lot of folks that are just going to Arizona and then coming over to our side on Nevada and expecting that facilities are open when they're not. So with that kind of framing, we're all experiencing a lot of challenges, but again, there are some opportunities here. But we're going to dive into a little bit more detail on three issues in particular that we're facing with respect to COVID and the nexus with natural resource management. So first, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Knight. Lloyd is the administrator of the Division of Plant Industries for the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. Lloyd.
How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. That was my mic check is what that was. Thank you, Kristen. Good morning to everyone from Idaho. I work at the Idaho State Department of Agriculture, and in addition to invasive species, we deal with exotic plant pests, phytosanitary certification and inspection for export of ag commodities. So we kind of have a wide range of activities that are affected by what we're talking about today. And so I'll just quickly go through that. And one thing I would note is that I see a number of my colleagues that are listed on here as attendees to the call. So I hope I do justice for what we're all dealing with. So to start with, we look at what we do here very regionally. We are just kind of one part of, not only are we taking care of what we need to for Idaho, but we also have a lot of interaction with so many of the state and federal agencies that are on this webinar today. And there's really a view of this that we know there's lots of layers, and we communicate that to ourselves and to policymakers and to employees and stakeholders within our state to try to give them some assurance that they don't really need to worry about just the one issue of what we're doing, but we need to also look at there's a lot of other layers going on, and we all work together. The challenge that this has presented, obviously, for all of us is very real from a policy and budget perspective of what resources we have available. But there's also a real human component to it because people are stressed. And what we saw with a lot of the boats that moved through the system earlier this spring as they left down south as snowbirds and went north, we saw some customers that came through that a little bit stressed. Maybe they had to leave earlier than they had planned. Certainly the folks that were headed to Canada had to deal with some of the travel restrictions that on them and closing the border. So we had to be sensitive to that. We have stakeholders that operate and cooperators that operate our stations actually rather than agency staff. We were lucky that we had all of those agreements done before the shutdowns happened, but it also meant we had to go back and work with those folks and make sure that they felt comfortable with the staff that they had on hand with operating those stations. And And we also continue to focus on that communication that needs to happen as those boats move through the system, if you will, as they leave, say, Lake Mead and go to Canada or go to Washington. And kind of help them understand that we are business as usual. The stations are still operating. They're still an essential service, certainly in Idaho, and I think with most everybody else that's on the webinar or on the call today that's represented. These are still essential services, and we still have a job to do. That presents not only that essential nature of we got to get the job done, but again, there's a customer service aspect there that we always have to be conscious of. To my knowledge, most of the operations in the region are still ongoing. We are still viewed as essential with regards to boat inspections, but we all have little nuances that we have to deal with now that are a little bit different. For example, in Idaho, we do have a hiring freeze on a number of our positions statewide. That does mean that some of what we would normally do in a season, outside of just the normal operation of check stations, we're gonna have to adjust a little bit. So we have to pull in our horns a little bit, focus on some priorities, and still go on with what we need to do for the season. I think that this map that you see in front of you of the Pacific or of the Columbia River Basin and surrounding areas, I think by the end of the year, you'll see that most of those activities are still there. There may just need to be some tweaks that have to happen with regards to some of those restrictions we may have from a budget and hiring perspective. We are continuing to communicate to stakeholders, though, about what we're doing. And part of what we do is from our website, they can jump off and find not only what's going on in Idaho with the dashboard that you have in front of you, which is from last year, at the end of last year. They can see not only what we're doing actively today, but they can also, there's some links there that'll let them see some of what's going on around the region as well. So I guess my bottom line message really is that it had an impact on us from some budget standpoints. It's had an impact on us in ensuring the safety and well-being, I think, of our operators, of our employees. We've had to make some tweaks to some protocols, but we are, by and large, still trying to maintain business as usual, if not trying to make a few adjustments. And with that, you can jump off on our website, see some of those activities, and we'll try to update that through the season. We're still just kind of getting started with our season. Most of our stations will finish opening up this weekend. We'll kind of see where things go from there. So with that, Kristen, I think that's about all I had.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lloyd. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dan Prenslow, who is the Director of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Dan.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about all kinds of issues that we're all dealing with. So I'll take more of a wildlife perspective on this. We're obviously parks and wildlife in Colorado now, but we've not had, it's kind of knock on wood, we've had lots of decision-making processes, but we've not had huge impacts on our hunting and fishing seasons. We've had some, we closed turkey season to one county, dealing with counties for a couple weeks. Had some other counties that wanted to, but it was the night before the season, and we respectfully declined. We just couldn't pull that off with a draw season on turkey season. But specific to fishing season, and again, like Lloyd talked about ANS, we made a decision that we were not going to close boat ramps. We ramped up early. We've been open for business. There was some worry about that. We've got a lot of pressure to close. We also had a lot of pressure, like everybody else, to open for health, personal health and well-being, and mental health and well-being. And so lots of kind of lobbying, complaints. We just deal with it as it comes on. But we've really been able to keep our parks open. We did have not camping. I'll talk about that later. And we've just opened camping too. So, but we kept our parks open. We were open for business. We were on home order just like everybody else, and we went to a 10-mile thing that, for the most part, people were ignoring. We tried to work hard to keep people out of the resort communities in the mountains because they were really the original hard vector for kind of around the ski areas. So mostly been pretty good about that. We've got, we still have issues. We're still working on trying to open up. It's not up to us. It really is Governor and Colorado Department of Health and Environment to working up guides, outfitters, rafters. There's some rafting that's just finally opening up this weekend because it's pretty tough to social distance while you're on a raft unless you're on your own family. So we're working on that. Obviously, it has been a big issue for customers. Partly they're just different information, different states, as we all know. In the West, we didn't have a quarantine. Other states around us had a quarantine. I should have been in Alaska last week, but couldn't afford a 2-week quarantine for a 4-day trip. So we're all dealing with that kind of thing. So I would say in Colorado, it's really not a platitude, it's a reality. We worked hard at managing to yes, thinking about making a bumper sticker. No simple, closing is simple, but it's a large economic and social impact. So we work to manage yes while keeping our customers and our staff safe. I can't say that's all been true. As we talk about federal partners and different states, some unfortunately I think are different issues, but some have been easier to say no, or that decision was made well outside of our decision space. I know for myself, I've had a lot of support. Keeping things open wasn't just me; it went really from the governor on down, and really appreciated that. So I have lost some decision space in this, in closing and opening things. I'm sure everybody on this call has, and so I think we ought to think about that for the future. That's definitely a change where you no longer are in charge because we've, the health department's making decisions for counties, so they're making it for the state, and they're making it at a national level. And so that's been a big change. We've, last but not least, I'll talk about worked hard at trying to balance. There are definitely people, they're not, for a couple of weeks, they were fine to stay at home, but again, state parks have been just off the charts and busy, and we were not geared up for midsummer kind of use. We had kind of winter staffing, and we've had people and issues on the landscape too because of people going out, and we get it. So we're trying to balance that. Well, hopefully most of that is short-term issues as it relates to balancing, human footprint on the landscape. But we for sure have tried to stay open just for that benefit for the people of this state and its visitors. So with that, maybe I'll just let's just hit some highlights and kind of open it up later. So appreciate the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Dan. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Grant Beebe. He is the Assistant Director of the Bureau of Land Management, Fire, and Aviation Center. Grant.
All right, thanks, Kristen. I'm actually not at work today. This is the first day all pandemic that I haven't been at work. I'm in my son's room taking care of my kids today. But the fire center's been open, like the previous two presenters have noted, essential services. Firefighters, obviously, essential services, essential workers. And one of the things we've been doing this spring is trying to keep them healthy going into the prime Western fire season. So we've scattered folks as much as possible. And even active firefighters, we've done a lot to encourage telework with folks who normally wouldn't telework. So it's been an aggressive stance there to try to keep people healthy going into the core fire season. One note about the spring, we've been pretty much 90% focused on COVID at the fire center, but our firefighters, many of them are coming off the international season we had helping out Australia. So it's been a little bit busy. I do work at the fire center in Boise, NIFC. I'll just note that I'm the BLM Assistant Director for Fire and Aviation, and that position's been out west in NIFC since the fire center was established in 1970. But we have state partners, tribal partners, Forest Service, all the DOI agencies there, FEMA, U.S. Fire Administration, Weather Service. So that's truly an international or an interagency scene there, including DOD. And we all know that fire doesn't know any boundaries, and so it takes all partners to really mount a response to fire, especially in the western fire season that's just getting ramped up. To note, nobody likes to hear this, but we are expecting a busy fire season, especially in the Pacific Northwest and the Great Basin. So we all know what that means. A normal fire season, we might mobilize as many as 30,000 folks at a given time. I think as Kristen alluded to, we are going to have some resource challenges, some of them being crews provided by inmate crews. So we have a number of challenges facing us this year, but we've been working pretty much full time on it for a while. So I'll run through a couple slides here. Next slide, please. So let me just note that firefighting, it's kind of an obvious statement, but we're all about managing risk. That's what we do on a daily basis. That's what we do year after year. And one thing we've been focused on with our firefighters is that COVID has elicited a number of responses from the agencies, and we're certainly hyper-focused on trying to provide safety for our employees, and at the same time recognizing that we have to fight fire. So if all those firefighting partners that I listed before aren't there, then fire is going to pose a risk to either other folks who are forced to respond in our stead, or to the public who are affected by fires. So we know we have to respond to fires. We know we have to balance the risk of COVID against the very known and very dangerous risks of fire. So that's been in the forefront from day one. We've got fire risk, we've got COVID risk. We have to manage both simultaneously. Next slide, please. So I'll say we've been planning since February. We had pandemic plans in place from the interagency perspective since swine flu, avian flu, you name it. We dusted off those plans in February and realized, well, what we knew then, COVID was going to be a different beast. We were going to have some unique challenges because of the nature of this pandemic. So we didn't just sit on those plans. We said, all right, we need to adapt them. We need public health expertise brought in to help us deal with what we know about COVID. We realized right from the get-go we were going to have some extreme challenges with things like large fire camps, with things like moving resources across boundaries. We all know that nobody's got enough resources to fight fire when they're in the peak fire season. Our very successful U.S. system for sharing resources depends on open borders and open sharing of resources and moving resources to where they're needed at a given time, or with luck, in advance of when they're needed. So we realized from the get-go, those large fire camps, they're vectors for disease in the first place. Even in the best case, with something like COVID, those were going to be a challenge to maintain. And then moving our resources across boundaries, we knew was going to be a challenge. Next slide, please. So some things about preventing spread. The challenge of this one, really for our professional firefighters especially, is that not only are people taking on risk for themselves as they do from the normal course of managing fire during a fire season, but we also want crews to know that they're not going to take disease home to their families and loved ones, right? So that's an additional challenge, an additional concern for all of our firefighters, that they don't take something home with them, right? It's one thing to take on risk yourselves. It's another thing to take the risk home. We don't want to overwhelm local health systems. So most of the time when we're fighting large fires, we're in remote communities that don't have often the kind of health systems that might need to be in place to take care of a number of people who are sick from COVID. And so we actually just wanted to minimize medical response. We want to do that by minimizing exposure. We've got a number of things we have in place, but we're doing our best to encourage folks to monitor their health on a daily basis with thermometers. We're doing the same things that CDC is recommending for other folks, daily basis with all of our firefighters, and that's something that's going to continue on throughout the whole fire season. Next slide, please. So logistics, I talked about large fires. We know what large fire camps look like. You can have, in some place like California, 5,000 folks responding to a given incident. We know that large fire camps are something we want to avoid. We have the issues of people camping close to one another or all in one spot. We have issues with caterers providing food to people and concentrating folks in mess tents. We know we don't want to do that. Things like shower units, we know those have to be on some different kind of disinfecting schedule. We need extra hand washing units. We know that briefings can be 500 people in a given spot, close quarters. We know we have to do that differently. We need to do spread, or we need to do virtual things. We know fires involve public meetings, and those are going to be different this year because we can't bring together people in close quarters the way we used to. Incident command posts in general, we know we need to spread those. We need to spread people in those. We know the medical units that we have as part of our fire response need different equipment, and those are up and ready to go with different equipment, but we know we have to manage differently there. And then we know travel is going to be a challenge. We have been working from the get-go to get all the partners to agree that firefighters need to travel, that we need to respond across borders. WGA has been a key part of that, but we've been talking especially to state level agencies to make sure that we recognize that critical infrastructure workers, that includes wildland firefighters, and that we need to be able to move across borders. Next slide, please. Finally, for our full-time firefighters, we know we have things like barracks that we need to manage differently when firefighters are living on top of one another. Traveling in vehicles is a challenge, and CDC has just come out with some new guidance for wildland firefighters that talks to these kinds of things. This bottom bullet here is really where we've ended up. The module is one concept, or we prefer to call it the family concept, where you look at a fire crew as a family. You make sure that they're clear of disease, and then you essentially keep them together, and just like you would in your minivan on the way to the lake, those folks know that they're disease-free and they can travel with one another in close quarters, right? So nobody wants to be in close quarters with somebody who might have the disease. So you test, you make sure that people are disease-free, and then you operate as a family unit as much as possible. So that's one of the keys to fire response. CDC has noted as well that we need to manage our folks in a different way. We can't abide by CDC rules in all cases that apply to civilians. For instance, masks don't function well at all when you're fighting fire on the fire line. We know that sometimes, like with a sawyer and the person who's working with a sawyer, you have to be right on top of somebody to maintain safety from things like dropping trees. So this is one of those cases where we don't want response to COVID to overwhelm what we know about fighting fire safely. Aircraft's another challenge. We know that pilot and co-pilot need to be right next to one another, and they can't necessarily wear masks while they're flying. So there are lots of things that are different about fighting fire that we need to accommodate in our risk management process. Ultimately, we need to manage our firefighters, though. First, we need to make sure that they are safe and that they feel like they're going to keep their families safe, and then we fight fire with that nice, well-rested, safe, and healthy workforce. I think that might be the last slide. Is there one more? Okay, thanks, Kristen.
Excellent. Well, I want to remind everybody that's on the webinar that you can ask your questions in the chat box. And as we wait for questions to come in, I'm going to ask a couple questions of our presenters. And the first question, and this is for all three of you, it relates to communication. I mean, when it comes down to it, I think that any weakness that has every weakness in the communication chain has really been amplified, whether it's from state to federal, or in the case of Idaho, for example, perhaps communication with the state, with Canada. So I wonder if you guys could describe how those early conversations worked with your counterparts, whether they're federal, state, even county in some cases, and trans-border. And what has this taught you about how things need to happen moving forward? How do you fix those communication challenges? And that will ultimately, I would hope, result in better communication chains in the future. Lloyd? I'm gonna start.
I was just waiting to know where you wanted us. I think it's always one of those things that you wonder if you've done it right, and you don't usually know until it's all said. Like our biggest challenge with this particular situation is communicating to folks that we're facing some of these issues, not just the closures, not just having to work from home and some of those issues, but we do have things like budget holdbacks and hiring freezes and those sorts of things that are really outside of our control as an agency, and in the big picture should be expected, quite honestly. And so communicating to stakeholders that, you know, this is the paradigm that we're having to operate in. Here's the key functions that we're still maintaining and are still out there. Here's some of the things we can't do. And no, I don't know when that'll change. And yes, we still care about your individual water body. You know, for us, that communication happens. It's not so much a timing issue as much as getting in front of the right audience in some of these local areas, and being able to assure them that we're not just falling asleep at the switch and walking away. You know, all of the states in the West face the same dynamic, that we have communities that might live on a particular water body that to them, that is the center of their universe in a very good way. That's their landscape, where they live, where they work, you know, and just where they are, and it is them. And it's one of those situations where we're having to, as we make those decisions and try to react to some of those things that are put upon us, like hiring freezes and budget holdbacks, you know, that we're clear in our decision-making process about what goes and what stays. And I mean, we're fortunate that we haven't had to make real big hard decisions, but there are some little things that we won't be able to do that are a big deal to those folks locally. And I actually have folks that are on the road this week for the first time since all these shutdowns happened that are having some of those same conversations this week. You know, and it's a challenge that is going to be ongoing through the rest of the year. But in some ways, it's not unique to what we face every year. It's a different message this year. So I don't think it's a message. I don't think it's a thing of timing. I think it's just a matter of we have ever-changing conditions, and we try to get the best information we can out there, and be consistent in that messaging, and be pretty forthright with those things that we know could still be changing, and we're not on solid ground yet.
Thanks, Lloyd. Dan or Grant, do you have anything to add?
This is Dan Prenzel. I would say, you know, barring the technical parts that obviously we had to ramp up on things that we weren't really, I'd never been on a Zoom call or a Google chat or any of the platforms. So I think everybody or a lot of people had done that, had to get through that. But I would tell you that I think communication's been really mostly fantastic. Internally, externally, I know I sent a lot more memos to all staff to keep them up to speed, but I will tell you externally too, we're doing a ton of social media, way more than we would have, trying to keep up to date. And as we work through some of this with our internal partners, it was brought to my attention, we were working on a document to open back up our camping on state parks and state wildlife areas. And we did that. And the next thing I heard through a different outlet that I wouldn't normally talk to said, yeah, we were really the template for everybody else looking at how they could do that. So I think that's part of that communication. You know, everybody's connected at one level. So I actually think we've had more communication with our county partners, partly to resolve the issues, and our federal partners than we would have without COVID. So some of it was forced because you had to deal with issues, but you know, we're here with Western Governors. I just got off the phone with coordination call with WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Service Agencies, dealing with that. And I seem to think that our communication's been much more trying to keep everybody up to speed, as it's such a changing landscape. So kudos to all of us, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So I see a couple questions that are in the chat that are related to seasonal staffing and how things might evolve or change and how y'all are ramping up. So Grant, I'm going to ask you this question. The science is pointing towards the potential for a second wave of pandemic, kind of right towards perhaps late summer, early fall, when we're looking at, as you put it, possibly an intense wildfire season. Could you talk a little bit about how y'all are balancing that against, I shouldn't say balancing it against, but how you're considering that in terms of how you're ramping up staffing and the like. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna, first, I'm not gonna speculate on the second wave because everything I've thought about COVID has been wrong so far. So let's just anticipate that COVID will be with us all summer, and what the peak looks like, I won't even speculate on. But like I said, we knew from the get-go we were gonna have resource challenges. So we took some steps right off the bat to say, we've got some partners that we might go to in really extreme fire seasons that we put on point early. So active duty military, we alerted them early on saying, normally in August, we might ask for a battalion of Marines to help out on firefighting. We may need to do it earlier this year because Department of Corrections crews in Arizona, for instance, don't look like they're going to be available. Or state responders are going to be so busy managing COVID, and this is where your second wave could come in, that folks who have medical response as part of their daily life might not be available to do wildland firefighter the way the feds can focus, right? So we knew we wanted as many resources as we could possibly have. That includes going internationally, goes to GARD, goes to contract resources, goes to all those partners who we might call at the peak of planning level 5, we call it, which is usually in August sometime. The other thing that we're focusing on is use of resources. So like I talked about a 5,000 firefighter fire in California. We know we need to be judicious about our resources. We know that we need to marshal them and use them where they're going to be most effective and where the risk is going to be greatly reduced. So we know we're going to have to really manage our resources the way we do really every big summer that we have in firefighting, but we need to be on top of our game, directing our resources to where they can be most effective. Our partners, state partners and federal partners, have all activated every possible aircraft fine, for instance, for firefighting. So we know that aggressive initial attack is the best policy in times like these. And I'll say most every year, catch them when they're small, catch them before they become big so that you don't have to have that fire camp. So between the Forest Service and the DOI agencies and the state agencies, we have brought on really every aircraft we can possibly find to support our ground troops, so that we can try to catch these fires small. I know the Forest Service has come out and said, managing fire for resource benefit is really not something that's on the table this year. Everybody's going to try to make sure that they minimize risk as best as possible by trying to catch their fires as small as possible, and that hopefully will help on that resource question. But we know we're going to have scarcity, and we know we're going to have to make some hard decisions about where to apply resources. That's an interagency, federal, state, local decision-making process. And we know we're going to have to do that soon and often, and it's going to be a long summer making tough decisions.
Thanks, Grant. So there are a couple questions related to invasive species. So I'm going to direct these to Lloyd. The first question is just about the diversion of with minimal resources at the state level in many cases, and a lot of those resources being diverted to public health. How's that impacting invasive species management? And also more broadly, do you have any anecdotes about management of invasive species and how that's being compromised? I mean, I think I'm a big fan of the Middle Fork of the salmon, for example, and I just think about how remote those the boat inspection stations are and the like. Any comments to that, Lloyd?
Sure. So, and this will be kind of Idaho budget nerd stuff, and every state's going to be a little bit different. But I can tell you that for us, any budget holdbacks that there have been kind of across the board with general fund. And if you divert resources to some of those other human health issues, at least in our budgeting system, that doesn't necessarily mean it got removed from our pot for invasives and noxious weeds. So we're fortunate from that standpoint. We still have to deal with a hiring freeze. We still have to deal with some budget holdbacks, but they're more manageable in that standpoint, from the standpoint that it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will. Bringing up the Middle Fork in particular, those are some of the kind of things, though, that we have to adjust to not being able to possibly do this year. So, for example, all of our 20 roadside inspection stations that are on that map that people will see when they come in and out of the state of Idaho are still operating, and they will operate normally as they would have if COVID had never happened. The things that won't happen will be some of those roving inspection crews or some of those seasonal folks that we would hire to do roving inspection, to help us with some of our surveys and that sort of thing. So we may not have anybody get to the launch into the Middle Fork this year as we have in past years. Now, we only did that a handful of days a year as it was. That's kind of the nature of our roving crews. They move around to some of these locations and try to get in touch with some folks that may not have seen an inspection station along the way. But those are the kind of things we probably won't be doing this season. And we'll have to get some of that other seasonal workload, like some of those surveys and monitoring projects, done with existing agency staff, internal within the agency. So there'll be full-time folks that we reassign to some of those kind of tasks. I think, like all of us are having to do, we have some parts of our agency that maybe their workload has been affected negatively. We have inspectors that work. We are a Department of Agriculture, so we have folks that work inspecting fruits and vegetables, for example. That world has changed dramatically with some of the work that they have to do. So if they have some free time, we'll reassign them to some of those duties and try to fill in some of those gaps that are left by not being able to hire seasonals. But those are the kind of decisions we're having to make on the fly. So we're not necessarily robbing Peter to pay Paul as much as we're just having to fill in some gaps that we can't fill. Every state's going to be a little bit different. And so, I would imagine that there's probably somebody on the phone now from another state that's having to face exactly what you're initially described with your question. And I really feel for them, because those are even more difficult to manage around those kinds of situations. We're fortunate in Idaho that there's been a priority placed by the legislature and by the governor's office for the basic structure of what we need to do with regards to invasives and weeds. And we're continuing to do that. And that's part of what I talked about earlier with communicating to stakeholders and getting them to understand that there's maybe some trimming that we're having to do, but we're not having to cut off whole trees and whole branches. It's just a few things that we're having to trim up a little bit.
Great, thanks for that. So I want to turn to Dan really quickly. Everybody has touched a little bit on outdoor recreation. And I want to dig into, you'd alluded to essentially to hunting and fishing. So how has COVID-19 really impacted hunting and fishing seasons in Colorado? And how does this relate back to the agency's ability to pursue future management priorities?
Yeah, I did touch on that, is that it really did still came down to decision making. So we had all kinds of pressure to close all turkey season, all fishing or boat ramps, and quite frankly, close all our state parks. And we really said no to most of that, and worked at managing to open and to yes. And so we're touch and go. We had to adjust. Still felt that we were really part of the solution, not part of the problem. People, I joke. I said, I don't know if you've ever fished, on the bank of a river or a lake, but if you ignore COVID for a minute, I don't know anybody that's ever walked 6 or 10 feet from me and sat down and started fishing. And if they did without COVID, I would have an opinion for them. So I think out fishing and hunting and camping, you're not anywhere near 6 feet. There are some pinch points for people. So anyway, we've kept a lot of that open. Some other decisions were made in different states. I'm not sure turkey season is going to really make or break anybody, but fishing season could financially. And I think the second part of your question, so I'll jump to the future. Nobody likes nobody has a crystal ball, but the more that there's border closures from state to state or entity to entity, I think creates not only confusion, but will create a real disincentive for people to be outside, which I think for the most part is very not only acceptable but healthy for people to be doing that. And so I think we ought to keep our eyes focused on the future. I know there's a lot of the healthcare people are really working to make sure that there's not a second bump so kids can go back to school. But I think we're going to have to learn to deal with the people that are more vulnerable and spend less time and energy restricting people that are less immune. And I'm not a healthcare inspector, but I think we really need to be thinking about that as we start to open and transition. So I am worried about border closures. I'm worried about hunting seasons this fall. A lot of people like to go and cross state lines and go to restaurants and stay in hotels. But I also know that hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation is pretty visceral in people's genetic makeup, for lack of a better term, and so they don't like to get told they can't do that. So we'll continue to try and figure out how to keep that open.
That's great to hear. So you just touched on a question that I have for all three of you about the future. Now, again, tremendous lessons have been learned and are still being learned as we work our way through this pandemic. What have you learned, and what practices, or just in general, what do you think is here to stay? What do you think has happened in the last several months that is going to become permanent in terms of the way that you perhaps change your management practices or your operations? And I'm going to put Grant on the spot here.
So, one thing that I hope is here to stay is more use of technology and more support for teleworking and remote working. That's been actually a revelation to a lot of us, that we could do a lot more of our work remotely than we could before. One question about seasonal resources, that came up before, and I'll just say we saved so much money in travel expenses from this spring that we were actually able to devote resources to hiring additional firefighters. So I think we're going to rethink some of our normal business practices, what we think we have to do, and really get down to what we need to do. I think this has been positive in that respect, and that we've really focused on what we absolutely need to do to provide a solid workforce to do this critical work for the country. And we realized that there are some things that we've been doing that aren't as essential as we thought they were. So that's been really a positive. The communication piece obviously is key. We have a hard time sometimes in the wintertime here getting the attention of folks when smoke's not in the air, so people don't pay attention to fire. And I think that's one of those lessons learned. We had a hard time getting the attention of some folks we really could have used the attention of early on. So we need a better strategy for that, for really anticipating these challenges we're going to have. When it's not really apparent. Really, it's hard sometimes to focus on something that's a couple months out when you've got something really dire staring you in the face. So we need to be more effective on that next time. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that. Lloyd, anything to add?
I think that, and it's not necessarily just invasives related, but I think it has been noted here several times, we are in a new working environment. And I think for all of our folks in our invasive species crews, obviously they're used to being out and remote a lot out of the year anyway. So for them, maybe it's not necessarily a huge change, except that this happened to land at a time of the year when they're wrapping up a lot of office stuff. So that did have a bit of an impact. It changes how we interact and travel with crews and seasonal employees and that sort of thing. We do a lot of travel in this state. Like all of the Western states, there's a lot of country to cover, and as managers, we're used to being able to get out and get on the ground, and that's been different to not be able to do that. I think some of that will come back. I know I have some travel coming up in the next couple of weeks as we start to get out of our holes and get around. I think how we interact with each other, though, on things like this are probably the biggest thing that's different. Also, that have been scheduled. Good luck to WGA and Bill Whitaker in getting us to ever travel again. This is awful handy, and you can't see me, so it works out pretty good. But those kinds of things are going to be the biggest change moving forward. And I think just kind of being ready to have your head on a swivel when the next pandemic occurs, and being ready to go through some of those decisions. We've talked about some of that internally, and a lot of it's just kind of office structure and resource structure, and how to approach. And that's something that we're probably going to do a little bit different going forward.
Thanks. Dan.
I think that generally, I think they covered, the other panelists covered most of it. I mean, obviously technology is a big thing. I think we're going to have to rethink some of our office versus home. I think everybody's going to be doing that. It's an interesting thing. I think the capacity for somebody to hire talent you know, if you're in New York City or Denver from around the country, and not have them live in your community is going to affect real estate markets and office spaces and things that we haven't quite contemplated yet. And some of that will be fantastic. Some of that may not be so good as we transition. So I think we'll work through collectively. We're going to work through all of that. I do believe at the end of the day, we along with most have just tried to batten down and continue in the normal with air quotes. But I don't know what normal is going to be, and I think if anything for me, and I don't have a laundry list yet, but it's not lost on me. This really got down to what do we really have to do? What is critical? And we do a lot of things that are really fantastic and we think are important at the time, but I'm not so sure would rank as critical. And you get down, you find out who's really critical when it comes down to water, you know, food, shelter, and space. And so I think that will be a collective discussion for all of us as managers into the future.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate those insights. So I'm going to ask each of you, we have only a couple minutes left, to leave us with some closing thoughts or to bring up any particular issues that perhaps we haven't covered today that you think are important for all of us to as we move forward. And Lloyd, I'm going to start with you. Final thoughts.
You know, I think that last set of thoughts was I think really important, and I think something we ought to reflect on. The fact that, you know, all of us at some point, I think that's the nature of the kind of planning that we go through each year, even on a normal year, is focusing on what really has to be done. And some of us over time, we think we do a real good job in expanding programs and expanding efforts, and those are good. But at some point, focusing on those key essentials and kind of getting back to basics and how we handle and manage staff and resources and how we do our jobs out there on the landscape is pretty important. And I think that's been a reflection you've seen not just in the work kind of topics that we all talk about, but even in our personal lives. And I think that's I want to echo that. I think that's a very important part of this coming forward, and how we relate with each other and how we work. I think that's a very important comment. Thank
you. And Dan, pearls of wisdom to contribute?
Well, I think I gave my only one. As I say, encourage everybody, manage to yes, while keeping your staff and the customers safe. And that's a mindset. Work on that, and best we can. And that includes me. Show a lot of grace as we go through that. People are dealing with all kinds of things that you won't understand, and you know, people are just react differently. So best we can, have a little grace with each other.
I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to the Manage to Yes bumper sticker. So thank you for that. And finally, I think a Grant, last words.
Plan for the worst, hope for the best. That's all I got.
And with about 30 seconds left, I think that was absolutely perfect. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today, and to all of you. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Western Governors, and also just a word of thank you to WGA for convening these folks together so we can all learn from each other as we move through this pandemic. Kevin, I believe you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Just a few final closing logistics for folks to note. Again, thanks to everyone for showing up, and thanks to all the panelists. I do just want to reiterate that this is the first webinar in a series that we'll be conducting under the Working Lands Roundtable. You can learn more about the WGA Working Lands Roundtable and find out more information on future webinars at westgov.org. Thanks again to everyone, and I hope to see everyone at our next webinar hosted in partnership with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, focusing specifically on COVID-19 and invasive species programs that will take place on June 3rd. So with that, I just want to offer one final thank you to Kristen, our moderator, and all of our panelists. I think this has been a really interesting event, and look forward to seeing everyone at future webinars. Thank you all. Bye.